I was lied to a lot as a child. I was lied to about Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. I was misled extensively about the nation I call home, its founding, and those who founded it. I was even lied to about the Pope. But of all the falsehoods I was fed, I think the one I continue to resent the most was about George Washington. And I think the main reason I resent it so much is that person after person refers to this falsehood as the reason they like this fellow so much as a historical figure. Now, personally, I'm a big fan of his myself, but for things he actually did. He's a towering figure in history, and not just because he was 6'2". He's incredible enough for things he actually did. Fiction is unnecessary and uncalled for. Now, don't get me wrong. As a Star Trek fan, I enjoy a good work of creative fiction as much as the next guy, as long as it's in the fiction section where it belongs. But when such a work is presented as fact, that's just dishonest. We have Washington's birth certificate, which means we can draw a pretty clear picture of his family tree, but the next record of his life, which survives to this day, has him 22 years old, serving in the British colonial army. There are, as far as I know, no surviving records from the period between these 2 points for historians to work with. The story of this fellow chopping down the cherry tree and then confessing to it has no basis whatsoever in fact. It was made up by a priest in order to teach children the value of honesty. Now here's something I don't get. How in the world are children supposed to learn the value of honesty from people who do not themselves grasp it? And what's more, look at the message. If a certain characteristic held true about Washington, it should hold true about you as well. Well, let's see. What else does that apply to? George Washington lived in Virginia. So if you don't, start packing. He ran a plantation, so there's no reason to have anyone in any other line of work. He traveled everywhere, either on horseback or in a horse-drawn carriage. Therefore, we must all get rid of our cars. He was Caucasian. Oh dear. He owned slaves. Oh dear. Surely we can all see that the simple fact that Washington did something is not adequate grounds to do it as well. If you want to teach your children the value of honesty, this is not the way to do it. Building up the father of our country on the basis of a fable is a travesty, especially considering that documented historical facts accomplish this particular end much more effectively. You see, in the British Empire, social status was everything, and for some reason, subjects born in the British Isles were automatically granted a higher social status than subjects born in the Empire's American colonies. In spite of this impediment, Washington had achieved a very high, respected status. But then one day he discovered this to be a trap. You see, to protect one's social status, one did not dare to marry someone on a lower social tier than yours. So when Washington fell in love with a woman on a lower tier, this turned out to be quite a problem, and later when circumstances forced him to marry a different woman, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. After this, he developed a reputation for a very quick, fierce temper. Apparently being married to a woman he didn't love, with no hope of even courting the woman he did, made him pretty irritable. Before this event, other injustices pushed him to the point where he supported the revolution. But this was the event that pushed him to the point where he was ready to lead it. But then he found himself in another dilemma. You see, Washington was a lion of a general. That is to say, he would have loved nothing better than to march his troops into the field to challenge the British forces directly. He would have loved to do that. But he didn't, because he understood that that way lay certain defeat. He knew there was no way for his forces to defeat the Redcoats in such a fashion, or even to survive such a confrontation. Instead, he forced himself to be a fox of a general, acting directly contrary to his own nature. He spent the entire Revolutionary War, all 8 years of it, going against his own nature, until the very last battle for the good of the forces he commanded and the country he fought for. That is, he fought not only the British, but also himself. The Continental Army, under his leadership, modified its strategy to rely primarily on hit-and-run tactics, what could loosely be called guerrilla tactics. He led his forces to strike at the British, and then to withdraw, and then to strike again, and again to withdraw, over and over again, doing their best to avoid actually getting into any battles. They didn't always succeed at this, but this was their objective. This was the manner in which they strove to conduct themselves, always doing their best to remain just out of reach of the British forces. The Continental Militia and later army was very quick to retreat when the British charged them, but were just as quick to stop retreating when the charge halted. The main objective, instead of being to knock the redcoats out of the fight, had to be to simply stay in the fight themselves until they were in a position to go on the offensive. Then suddenly one day, the French were involved, and the war changed, and shortly thereafter the Americans were in such a position. Then one day came the end of the war. The last of the British forces surrendered. General Cornwallis of the British offered his sword to General Rochambeau of the French, who directed him to give it instead to General Washington. Now let's take a moment to consider John Adams. He was the second shortest of the Founding Fathers, and arguably the loudest. He spearheaded the argument in the Continental Congress in favor of independence. He was the one who nominated Washington to lead our troops, much to the disappointment of John Hancock. He was our first ambassador to Britain, our first vice president, and our first president. In the midst of his participation in this body, he corresponded frequently and heavily with his wife Abigail. His correspondence with her was so frequent and so heavy that many a historian refers to Abigail Adams as a founding mother. In one of her letters to her husband are found these immortal words: "All men will be tyrants, given the chance." Now, I would really like to believe that I wouldn't, but then I've never been given the chance, nor have I come close. I've never gotten the slightest taste of what it would be like to be a tyrant, so for all I know, this could very well apply to me. I have no doubt that it applies to the overwhelming majority of men who have ever existed, but one reason I hold General Washington in such high regard is that he proved that it did not apply to every last one of us. Certainly not to him. In order to help him fight the war, the Continental Congress pledged to his command complete control over every resource at U.S. disposal, thus giving him the chance to be a tyrant. After the war ended, this administrative body came to him and politely asked him to give that control back. He didn't have to do it. If he had refused, there would have been nothing whatsoever this body or anyone in the country could have done about it. But he didn't. The war ended, and he freely gave up that control without so much as a protest. He had his freedom, and he was content. Washington was an exception to this ominous passage, but it would not surprise me to learn that he is the only one history has ever furnished us. Then he retired to his plantation in Mount Vernon. He adopted a dog, which he named Cornwallis, after the British general he had just defeated. Washington's sense of humor may not have been quite as good as Benjamin Franklin's, but there's no denying that he had one. Years later, the Articles of Confederation were thrown out and the Constitution was adopted in their place. The Constitution created the position of president, which means that we had to hold an election. Because of his service in the Revolution and his actions at the end of it, the trust for Washington was so great that his election was absolutely sweeping, even though he himself did not want to be president. And then, after 8 years in office, he barely got to enjoy his retirement for 3 before he died. Now, I find it a pretty remarkable display when someone is willing to die in defense of a country and its principles. But I find it no less remarkable when an entire life is sacrificed in that same service, a day at a time. That is why I venerate George Washington. That makes him extraordinary. As you can see, George Washington, while far from perfect, was an incredible man, and the documented historical facts establish this 100 times better than that preposterous fable.